Welcome back. In this video, we'll be looking at the major argumentative components. These are the constituent parts of an argument and thereby the constituent parts of an argumentative essay. So we've established previously that essays usually all follow the same format or structure, this being the introduction, body, conclusion structure, which we call the IBC structure. Now, that being said, certain essay types have specific requirements or components because obviously the objectives of the essays change. So the expository essay, for instance, is trying to explain something. Therefore, we usually see that essay have examples. And in the case of the argumentative essay, we usually see evidence in place of examples. Examples can serve as evidence, but we also see different types of evidences. And the point is here that we would typically not see evidence servicing an expository essay, whereas we would see evidence servicing an argumentative essay. So essays have different demands because they are trying to accomplish different things. Even though the structure may be similar, they have different purposes and therefore require different approaches when they're being composed. An argumentative essay is interesting in that it has three specific components that are mostly unique to its genre. And these components are claim, evidence, or what we'll call warrant, and the last is what we call the counterargument or rebuttal. So an argumentative essay typically will have at least a claim and evidence. And sometimes if it is extremely sophisticated or particularly nuanced, it will include also a counter argument, at least one, which is also known as a rebuttal. So again, when I say warrant, I'm referring to supporting evidence. When I say rebuttal, I'm referring to essentially a counter argument. And a counter argument is simply an argument against whatever the argumentative essay is trying to advocate. Now, it may seem counterintuitive to include a counter argument within one's argument, but we'll discuss why that's actually beneficial if done correctly in an argumentative essay. So let's now proceed to define what these components are and why they are critical to the success of an argumentative essay. So the claim of an argumentative essay is very simple to understand. This is basically the main argument. This is the idea or belief or stance or behavior or whatever the case is that the writer is arguing for. So let's take the example of should students wear uniforms or not when going to school. If the writer is arguing that students should wear uniforms, then the claim would be students should wear uniforms. Vice versa, if the writer, is arguing against students wearing uniforms, then the claim would be students should not wear uniforms. So claims are pretty simple to understand. That is essentially the main idea that is being argued. It is not to be confused with the evidence. The evidence is in support of the claim. The claim itself is the main thrust or main idea or concept that the writer wants to persuade the reader. Now, evidence or the warrant is obviously the points in support of the claim. And so without evidence, the argument really is toothless. One cannot simply have a claim, right? That would be what we call an empty argument because the argument lacks sufficient evidence to make it compelling or persuasive. For instance, if the writer is making the claim that students should not wear uniforms, but cannot provide any positive or affirmative evidence in support of that claim, then the reader is going to be skeptical of the claim. What merit does it have? What are the benefits to students wearing uniforms? So it's very important that a claim is backed up by sufficient evidence. And so there is a difference between affirmative evidence and what we call negative evidence. So let's look at that quickly before we move on. Affirmative evidence would essentially be evidence about why one should go forward with a claim, and negative evidence would be why one should avoid the opposite of the claim. So let's clarify that. So we have affirmative versus negative. And so this would be, in the example that we're discussing, why students should wear uniforms. And in the case of the negative, this would be the detriments of not wearing uniforms. And so a effective and nuanced, thorough argumentative essay would look at both sides of this. It would suggest that students should wear uniforms for various affirmative reasons, one being perhaps increased school spiritedness, another being perhaps greater uniformity and more of a collectivist spirit among the students, thereby discouraging things like bullying and alienation. Some of the detriments to not wearing uniforms would be possibly increased bullying, increased lack of commitment or investment in the school environment, and so on and so forth. So an argumentative essay can include both affirmative or negative examples. Usually a good argumentative essay will include both because it is trying to provide a well-rounded view of the topic. So there must always be evidence in support of a claim, and there must always, of course, be a claim, which is the main thing being argued. Now, in the case of the counterargument or the rebuttal, this is a unique case in that the counterargument or rebuttal is not necessarily mandatory for an argumentative essay. The rebuttal will typically improve the effectiveness of an essay, but it is not mandatory. As long as one is backing up a claim with evidence, there is an argument. Is the argument good? Is the argument compelling or persuasive? Is a different story, but the credentials or the criteria to meet the argumentative essay are met by those two. So where does the counter argument or rebuttal come into play? The counter argument or rebuttal plays a very important part in the argumentative essay, in that the counter argument demonstrates that the writer is aware of opposing arguments. For instance, if we are again arguing about students wearing or not wearing uniforms at school, if a writer is aware that there are possible counter arguments, such as students not wearing uniforms because that would suppress the student's personal expression, which is very critical, especially for children and adolescents who at that time in their lives are trying to develop their own personalities and their own personas and trying to discover themselves and their interests, and that the school uniform would suppress that process and stymie it and perhaps have negative impacts later on in their lives. If the writer can anticipate that argument and provide a response to it, the writer actually improves his or her credibility. So the writer demonstrates an awareness of opposing arguments. The writer demonstrates developed thinking that already provides an answer to those arguments. So this creates more support for the actual argument being made. And it also presents a lack of bias, meaning that the writer has entertained opposing perspectives and that he or she has considered how others view those topics. So the benefits of the rebuttal, again, are awareness of opposing arguments, responses to opposing arguments, which are important because these responses, again, further solidify and cement the main claim. And then this also demonstrates a lack of bias. The writer has looked beyond his or her own purview and has considered other views and has hopefully come to a thorough understanding of them, meaning that the writer not only understands thoroughly his or her own perspective, but also the perspective of others, especially if they are in opposition. And so this means that the writer understands the different perspectives about the issue and has come to an informed conclusion about which is the correct, or we should say most correct perspective based on the situation and different factors affecting it. So this is why a rebuttal can be very important to the success of an argument. The rebuttal demonstrates that the writer is credible, that he or she has thought about various perspectives and how they affect the issue, and that he or she has considered all of these different opposing views and decided on one being the most optimal. This also gives the writer the opportunity to respond to possible counter arguments, which is sort of like a form of protection or armoring. Kind of a silly example, but I always think about the movie 8 Mile starring Eminem. In the climactic scene of that movie, Eminem is engaged in a rap battle with a rival rapper. And during his rap, Eminem basically self-deprecates, right? He anticipates all of the possible arguments or attacks that will be made against him by the rival rapper. And this leaves the rival rapper without any means of recourse, right? He or she anticipates, or rather Eminem anticipates all of the various arguments. The rival rapper has nothing to say as a result, and therefore he loses the rap battle simply because Eminem thought about everything that would be used against him and came up with a response against it. And so because of this, the rebuttal in some ways can be the make or break feature of an argumentative essay, but it must be done well. If we do not have a response to the rebuttal, so if we're arguing for school uniforms, we make the argument, or rather we include the counter argument that school uniforms suppress student individuality and self-expression, and yet we do not respond to that, then all we've done is weakened ourselves because we've opened ourselves up to attack and we have no defense for the attack. You can think of it as stabbing or shooting yourself, right? You have wounded yourself, you have wounded your argument, and you have not provided a way of countering that attack. And so that actually weakens your argument. Typically, students, when they're including rebuttals, have difficulty responding to rebuttals, or they forget to include the response. And this leads to a sort of a disassociative style to their argumentative essay, where they begin arguing for a certain claim, but midway through the essay, they begin expanding on a counter argument, and it starts to sound like they are arguing for two different things within the paper, one being the main claim, two being the counter argument. It's very critical that if you are writing an argumentative essay, you make pains to provide a response to the rebuttal. If you do not do this, you're weakening your argumentative essay overall, and possibly leading to its failure rather than its success had you simply responded to the rebuttal. So argumentative essays will have three main components to review. These are, again, the claim, the warrant or supporting evidence, and finally, the rebuttal or counter argument. As we stated, the first two are mandatory. These are necessary for an argumentative essay to exist, whereas the rebuttal and counter argument are not necessarily mandatory, but they do help improve the robustness of an argument. On the note about the rebuttal, it can be very helpful to have multiple rebuttals. Often there are many different counter arguments, and the more that a writer can anticipate and respond to, the stronger his or her main claim will be. It's also important to note that some rebuttals are stronger than others, meaning that there can be easy arguments that superficially will make the writer look good because he or she has responded to them. But if a writer refuses or avoids really important or difficult to defend against rebuttals, this can actually make the writer look weaker because he or she is acknowledging that these rebuttals implicitly are too strong to defend against. So it's very important when you are writing an argumentative essay to not shy away from responding to strong rebuttals. If you cannot respond to them, then that means that you need to think through your own argument more strongly and you need to consider more thoroughly its benefits and its detriments. With that said, I hope that this provides some clarity as to the argumentative components, which are the unique parts of the argumentative/persuasive essay. In future videos, we will look at how these would manifest in practice when writing an argumentative essay. Thanks for your time.